Hi, welcome to Pocket Pulp. This week we have a really fun story. Beauty Knows No Pain by Mark Blickley. Mark said he found inspiration to write this story from John Cage's 433. I'm going to post a link to that in the notes, and I really recommend after this you go check it out because it'll give you a little insight, and it really is astounding. Mark is from New York. He's a widely published author of fiction, nonfiction, drama, and poetry. He's also the recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Scholarship Award for Drama. He is a proud member of the Dramatists Guild and PEN American Center. He is the author of Sacred Misfits, published by Red Hen Press, Weathered Reports, Trump Surrogate Quotes from the Underground, published by Moira Books, and his latest book, Dream Streams, is a text-based art collaboration with fine arts photographer Amy Basson, and you can find that on the Clare Songbirds Publishing House website. I will make sure to post a link in the notes. You can also follow him on Twitter @BlickWords or on Facebook, Mark Blickley, and I'll post all those links in the notes. Also, just yesterday, he had something premiere on Radio Brennpunkt, CMPFR.22C, which stands for Stories from the 26th Century Campfire. This is a collaboration of storytellers, actors, artists, and sound artist designers around a sonic campfire to create a collection of stories imagining the decades of the 22nd century. And that sounds really fascinating, and I will be sure to drop a link in the notes for that as well. All right, so let's get to the story. But before I do that, if you're enjoying Pocket Pulp, please like, subscribe, rate, write some comments, share it. Let's get the word out there because I'm enjoying doing it, and I hope you're enjoying listening to it. Okay. And now, Beauty Knows No Pain by Mark Blickley. Read by Eric Brian Moore. I'm Eric Tesler. I'm here because Dr. Wanda Platt says I have to be here, and because I know this group therapy session is good for me. As Dr. Wanda Platt says, the time has come for me to take the bull by the tail and face the situation. I was in a coma for nearly 5.5 years. A little over a year ago, I snapped out of it. Dr. Wanda Platt says these bones are gonna heal, but that my mental health is kind of shaky. But so's yours, right? Or else why would you be here too, right? I'm supposed to tell you what happened to me, how I got here. That'll be kind of easy. I spent 5.5 years doing nothing but thinking about what happened. This past year, I talked to lots of people who helped me piece together the events leading up to my appearance in this hospital room. I understand what happened. I'm not sure why it happened. I don't even know where to begin, except for this typically gray, late autumn afternoon in Rantoul, Illinois, when I was 12 years old. Now, when I say it was a typical Sunday afternoon, I mean that all over town, television sets were screaming out halftime scores, and town fathers were critiquing football games from bar stools while their kids were in the streets pretending to be the Chicago Bears. It was after a particularly vicious tackle on me by the Levitsky brothers that I flung down my helmet, threw off my makeshift shoulder pads, and kicked Wayne Levitsky in the nuts, and trotted off into my living room where my father was lying on the couch watching a game on TV. I stood in front of the set, blocking his view, and said, "Father, I don't want to play football. I want to take music lessons." My father propped himself up on the couch, angling his way past me, and yells, "For Christ's sakes, can't you call me Dad or Pop or Old Man? What's wrong with you? Go outside and play some ball and don't go bothering me again about music lessons." Then he launched into his, "When I was your age, I was playing halfback and defensive tackle and damned hard, too. Except for Iggy Bolton, I was the best." Just as he finished that sentence, my mother walked into the room. At the time, she was a chain-smoking woman of 37. My mother was famous for two things. One was an enormous capacity for migraine headaches. The other was her punctuating of each sentence with a cough, which isn't all that surprising when you consider she smoked 5.5 packs of cigarettes a day. Anyway, she walked in because she heard my plea for music lessons and was pretty sick of my whining about it. You see, I'm cursed with a photographic memory, and I'll never forget what she said. "Come on, Eric, give me a break. I could just imagine you honking a horn around here. I'd be dead in a week. I hear enough car horns from the street to last me a lifetime." Now, mind you, I never said anything about playing a horn. I didn't know what kind of instrument I wanted to play. I just wanted to play something. But after she told me this, she starts gagging real bad. My father instinctively reached out and slapped her on the back without taking his eyes off the game. At this time, I was reading the book that would influence me more than any other book I'd ever read. It was entitled Beauty Knows No Pain and subtitled Biographies of Obscure Musicians Who Overcame Personal Handicaps in Pursuit of Their Art. I remember the characters in that book as clearly as if they were my next-door neighbors. I was inspired by an oboe player with asthma, a drummer with metal hooks, a midget conductor, a hair-lipped flutist, a pianist with 6 fingers on one hand, and a 72-year-old woman who learned to play the tuba after undergoing surgery for the removal of a lung. My father once caught me reading Beauty Knows No Pain. I was stretched out on my bed, totally absorbed in the chapter about Maestro Arnold, the midget conductor, when my door slams open. I panicked and tossed the book under my bed. "Got you," laughed my father. "What are you trying to hide from your old man?" he asked. "Nothing, Father. You just scared me, that's all." But as Father approached me, grinning, he pointed under my bed. "You got something under there you don't want me to see?" "No, Father." He groped under the bed until his hand latched onto the book. Then he slapped me on the shoulder with his other hand as he pulled the book out and said, "Don't worry. I won't tell your ma. Us men gotta know when to stick together. When I was your age, I used to keep these playing cards from Japan with pictures of these gorgeous—" He held up the book, frowned, and then flung it at me. "What's this shit?" "It's just a library book, Father." "Then why are you hiding it?" Because I knew it would upset you." "I ain't buying that. What are you using this book for?" "To learn," I whispered. "This book been exciting you, boy?" "Yes, Father." "When I was 14, this ain't the kind of books excited me. Where's the broads?" "It does have an incredible story of a woman who learned—" He grabbed me off the bed and dragged me into the hall. "You're weird," he screamed at me. "Yeah, I'm showing this to your ma." My mother was sitting on the living room couch, coughing, as she stripped her colorful nails with a cotton swab and a bottle of polish remover. Father held the book out to her as she crushed a cigarette butt into the ashtray. "You want to see the stuff your son is reading?" Mother took the book, looked it over, and put it down. She put the bottle of remover on her lap as she continued to work on her nails. I told her it was the best book I ever read. My father became enraged. "Yeah, I'm telling you, the kid don't use both hands to turn the pages. Look at them rings under his eyes." Mother said, "That's because he won't eat his vegetables." I thought I heard an ally, so I told her all about the musician characters. She was quite interested in, or more accurately put, obsessed with the tuba player. She lighted a cigarette and kept badgering how the woman had lost her lung. I told her I didn't remember. She asked me if I was telling the truth. "Who cares about that old broad?" my father screamed. "Midget conductors? What a role model!" Just then, my mother had a coughing fit. Her cigarette dropped out of her mouth and onto her lap, igniting the highly flammable nail polish remover. Flames roared up. My father and I reacted quickly, and with seasoned teamwork, we successfully extinguished the fire. Mother came away with only minor burns, a scorched eyebrow, and some singed bangs. You know, the more I thought of what these musicians had to go through to learn their craft, the more I would plead with my parents to buy me musical instruction. Because they wouldn't let me have music lessons, I devised a unique system of creating music. It's the nearest I could come to musical composition. You see, I take my 2 transistor radios, plug an earphone into each one, stick an earplug in each ear, and then tune into 2 different stations at the same time. One station might be playing classical, the other jazz or rock. I was always flipping the selector dials, making different matchups. And when the 2 musical forms would meet inside my head, I could create a new sound that no one else could hear but me. I knew my father would rather roast in hell than have any son of his taking music lessons, so I concentrated my campaign on my mother. My mother was never a demonstrative woman when it came to showing affection. In fact, the only thing she ever puckered her lips for was a cigarette. But I knew she loved me when she finally agreed to give me the money she had been secretly saving for a chest x-ray. It wasn't difficult finding a music instructor. Rantoul boasted only one such man, Professor Theodore Bint. Professor Bint was a tall, skinny man of 52, permanently bent over as a result of constipation cramps. These cramps were due to his daily staple of fried chicken. You see, the professor's music studio was located above a chicken-lickin' franchise. Bint was a bachelor who didn't know how to cook, so he depended on his business neighbor for meals. It seems convenience always won out over cramps. Besides, after 9 years on such a diet, he craved the grease. At one time, I thought he had self-destructive impulses because of this diet, but now I think it was just money. Inflationary times always cause men like Bint hardship. The little brats, that's what he called them, would happily sacrifice their music lessons to the family budget. I'm sure these sacrifices made the $1.56 3-piece lickin' special with fries and a bun a necessity. By the time I was ready to seek out the professor, things had gotten so bad he was forced to hawk most of his instruments. I remember his studio containing trombones minus the slides, pianos without brass pedals or benches, cellos without their bows, and the electric guitars, which Bint claimed was the only thing the little bastards wanted to play, were missing amplifiers. The first thing that struck me about the professor was his teeth. When he gave me his professional smile, I noticed his teeth were the same color as the yellowed newspaper clipping taped to the wall behind his desk. After freeing myself from his desperate handshake, I glanced at the clipping. Underneath this picture of a kid taking a check from a fat man, the caption read, "Teddy Bint, child prodigy, wins Rantoul's annual John Philip Sosa Memorial Award." I was impressed. Professor Bint stood up and bent over me. "So, you want to be a musician, eh, son? Wise choice. I could tell by your bearing you have the sensitivity for a creative instrument. Are you thinking of becoming a pianist?" I told him I wasn't exactly sure what instrument I wanted to play. Professor Bint clutched his stomach during a particularly fierce attack of cramps and looked around his studio. "You don't own an instrument?" If I'd owned an instrument, I wouldn't be in this room right now. Bint's sister, who was a big fan of mine, sent me the professor's journals 4 months ago. She thought they would help encourage my recovery. Obviously, she hadn't read them. According to his journal, on the day I arrived in his studio, Bint was in the midst of his most severe financial crisis. He had no money and no working instruments. When I told him I didn't own an instrument, Bint spotted a saxophone in one piece and lunged for it. And when he handed it to me, he knew it was missing a reed. A reed is a thin piece of cane attached to the mouthpiece. It's set in vibration by the breath and is the sound-producing agent for the instrument. In other words, no sound comes out of a saxophone without using a reed. If a sax has a mouthpiece, it looks like a complete instrument. The professor ran out of reeds because he had a nasty habit of using them as toothpicks to dislodge annoying bits of chicken that stuck in his teeth. Anyway, I'm standing there caressing this big, beautiful brass thing. I'm instantly hooked on the saxophone. Professor Bent tells me the saxophone is one of his most expensive instruments. He says that my rental fees will be higher, but they can go towards purchasing it. I immediately agreed. Then Professor Bent explained the romantic history of the saxophone, that it was invented by Adolphe Sax in 1846, and how it was one of the few instruments that has no exotic forebear. A complete original, Bent says. A complete original. I stood there hugging this saxophone like it was my first girlfriend. Then I carefully brought its neck to my lips, bit into the mouthpiece, and blew. Silence. I blew harder. Nothing except the sound of me exhaling and the rumbling of my teacher's stomach. "What's the matter, Professor Bent? Is it broken, or am I doing something wrong?" Professor Bent wrapped an arm around my shoulder. No, there's nothing wrong. Listen, Eric, anyone can pick up an instrument and create noise. If you step on a dog's tail, it will create noise. But you're special. I sense it. Together we shall transcend musical tradition. We'll bypass creating music for the ear and concentrate strictly on creating music for the soul. You must never forget that every great musician who has achieved historical immortality is not remembered by his technical expertise, but for his soul. I wasn't exactly sure what he was talking about, so I kept staring at the yellow newspaper clipping while gently running my fingers over the saxophone keys. What do your parents think of you taking music lessons? I told him they're not too interested. I explained that my mother had given me the money for instruction, but she said that I was on my own. Bent clapped his hands in joy. Wonderful, wonderful! No outside interference. I asked him again why no sound came out of my saxophone. You weren't using your imagination, son. You tried to take the shortcut from here. He pointed to my throat. To here. He pointed to the sax mouthpiece. Instead of having the music travel from here. He traced a line from my heart to my forehead, and then to here. His finger traced the length of the saxophone. You were being artistically lazy, but we shall overcome that. I'm not a lazy person, Professor. I'll work very hard. Bent squatted by my chair and put his arm around my shoulder. It is not that kind of laziness, my boy. It is ignorance of the spirit of creation. You must tame this spirit, put it on a leash before you can qualify as an artist. I want you people to understand that I was lonely, and Bent was the first adult I'd ever met who genuinely seemed to care about me. I trusted him because I needed someone to trust. It's that simple. I needed to love and trust this man. I was convinced that some cosmic force led me to pursue music lessons just so I would establish contact with this caring genius. Despite the ridicule of family and friends, I kept a strict daily schedule of 6 soundless hours of practice, in addition to Professor Bent's instruction 4 times a week. No one at home said anything about my mute instrument. My father was ashamed of his sax-toting son and was too angry for words. My mother thought that her X-ray money was put to good use. There were no more whines from her son or his new toy. God, I loved my saxophone. With Professor's guidance, I entered a trance-like state whenever my lips touched the mouthpiece. I can't describe the joy I got from playing my sax. My eyes would automatically close and I'd just drift. Not only could I hear this rich music, but I'd see such incredible colors and visions, and the smells, oh, the smells. It was beyond joy. Sometimes I'd capture this penetrating sorrow, but that too was exquisite and always left me refreshed. I had tapped that special place Professor Bent assured me I'd find. I know it sounds strange, but the vibrations inside my instrument shook spirit and released these. Gershwin once said he had more tunes in his head than he could put down on paper in 100 years. With Professor Bent's revolutionary approach, a musician didn't need 100 years to complete his vision. Music isn't marks on a paper or grooves on a CD or even the noise from the instruments. It's here, inside your head. The saxophone supplied a structure. It channeled my musical energies. I may have played without a reed, but Professor Bent taught me all the fingering and breathing techniques any saxophonist needs to be accomplished on the instrument. Look, anyone can play an instrument. Only a select few can compose and create art. The professor's teachings didn't limit me to the sounds a saxophone can make. When my saxophone took off, it wasn't an instrument, but instrumental in producing a music no single woodwind or even orchestra could reproduce. It was energy and love and anger. When I was 17, Professor Bent died. My last meeting with him is forever burned in my memory. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon. I walked up to his studio for my lesson. He wasn't there. That was quite unusual, but I knew he was probably downstairs at Chicken Licken having a snack. I remember shielding my eyes as I looked through the Chicken Licken window, trying to spot the professor. When I couldn't locate him, I went inside. I surveyed the entire restaurant. Professor Bent wasn't there. I spotted Licken's manager. "Excuse me, has Professor Bent been here today? I have a 4:00 appointment. He's never been late. I'm worried." This skinny guy in a shiny red jacket tells me that I have a right to worry. He said that the night before Professor was eating his dinner at the table he always ate at, when he sort of squealed and collapsed. I grabbed the manager by the lapels. "What happened? Where is he?" The Chicken Licken chief pleaded with me to calm down. Then he tells me that he thought Bent had choked on a chicken bone or something, but that nobody had heard him gag. "Where is my professor?" I shouted. By now, the entire restaurant had turned in our direction. I released my grip on him. He recovered his breath and told me he had called an ambulance. As far as he knew, Bent was at Rantoul General. When I walked into the hospital room, I saw a doctor fidgeting with some life support equipment attached to the sleeping professor. When the doctor asked me if I was a member of his family, I told him I was the sick man's son. He then informed me that Bent had suffered heart failure and had been slipping in and out of consciousness for 16 hours. My saxophone was slung over my shoulder. I caressed it as I looked down on my ghostly white mentor. "I think it's important you're seeing him now," said the doctor. He stared at my saxophone and asked if I played. When I nodded, he told me that he had played sax in his medical school band. He said he was a real big fan of birds. "Bird? What birds?" "Bird. Charlie Parker, you know, Bird, the greatest sax player who ever lived, with the possible exception of Red Gorky Jr. After your visit, please report to Nurse Pinkley at the reception desk to fill out the proper forms, okay?" Then the doctor patted me on the arm and left me alone with my spiritual father. I leaned over my comatose instructor and pleaded with him to lie. "Don't die, Professor. Please don't die." I held out a small paper bag I had brought with me. I guess you can't hear me, Professor, but I brought you a gift. It's soup, chicken soup. Want some? Come on, Professor Bint. Eat some soup, please. Bint didn't respond, so I removed the container from the bag and waved the soup underneath his nose. His eyes popped open. Attaboy, Professor. I began feeding him with a plastic spoon. Most of the soup spilled down Bint's chin, but his eyes were wide with anticipation. Can you speak, Professor Bint? He moved his mouth, but all you could hear were groans. Take it easy, Professor. Maybe you shouldn't try to speak. Save your strength. Bint began clenching and unclenching his fist while his mouth moved stupidly. And then I heard a hoarse whisper, Wrong. Wrong. What's that? What did you say, Professor? Wrong, he choked out. Am I doing something wrong? I asked. Me. Wrong. Yes, Professor. Need money, he said. Don't worry about money. Just concentrate on getting better. Bint raised his clenched fist. Me. Wrong. Need money. Oh, please don't make yourself upset. Is there anything you want me to do? Go, he croaked. I'm not leaving you, Professor Bint. I'll never leave you. Go, he insisted. I hugged Bint. As sick as you are still trying to spare me from anything that's not connected with beauty. I won't leave. He spit chicken soup in my face. You don't like the soup? I'm surprised, Professor. I got it from your favorite deli. I'll get whatever you need. Just try to relax. Ears, he whispered. What about ears, Professor Bint? Can't you hear me? Me bad need money. What's money got to do with anything? You're not bad because you don't have a lot of it. That's what you always taught me. You're an artist, a pure artist, and you've made me one too. I love you for that. Bint used his last remaining bit of strength to pull himself up. He glared at me and said, I confess. I asked him if he wanted me to get a priest to hear his confession. He shook his head. No, you. Professor Bint let out a death rattle and fell backward with his mouth open. Come back! Come back here, Professor Bint! You can't leave me! I won't let you! I buried my face in his neck and cried. Then I started pounding his chest with my fist, trying to pummel his heart back into motion. It's too big to stop beating. Too big. Too big. Come on. Beat. 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 I quit pounding on the dead man's chest. As I reached over to close Bint's eyes, my saxophone slid off my shoulder and hit the professor in the face. I put the mouthpiece between Bint's lips and positioned his still warm fingers onto the keys. I tried not to cry. I tried to think clearly and responsibly. I told Professor Bint that he would remain alive as long as I lived. I'm dedicating my life to the completion of your vision. I'm dedicating my life to our art. And then the professor lets loose with a really humongous death rattle. Every bit of gas that was trapped inside that corpse had to have been expelled. It both frightened and excited me, and the smell wasn't too pleasant either. My saxophone was still inside his mouth. This meant my sax had captured Professor Bint's final breath. It was no longer a musical instrument, but a monument to his genius and devotion. I won't let you down, ever. I swear. Strange. I tried to close Bint's eyes, but they wouldn't stay shut. Believe me, it's not like in the movies. They kept popping open. He stared up at me with a mixture of terror and anger that gave me nightmares for years and years. The autopsy attributed his death to a cholesterol-induced stroke. I was devastated. I dropped out of school and drifted around Chicago trying to peddle my sax to the clubs, but no one would listen to me. To tell you the truth, I almost packed it in. But every time I picked up a phone to call home, I'd remember the professor, eyes half shut, lips twisted, conducting me with a half-eaten chicken leg. By the end of my first few weeks in Chicago, I was tired, hungry, and broke. I slept on park benches at night. But I did have an interesting artistic experience early on in the Windy City. It was quite late at night, and I was sitting on a park bench gently polishing my saxophone. A wino staggered by. I shot him a quick look and continued cleaning my sax. I prayed he'd go away. But instead of leaving, he stuck his face right up to mine and said, "You gotta use elbow grease, boy. Don't be lazy." I told him to keep moving. Then he says, "There's a saying around this city that if you rub that thing hard enough, a genie will appear." I ignored him. "You don't believe it?" He extends his hand to me. "My name's Eugene, but my friends call me Genie." I asked him if he was going to make some magic. "Hell no! I ain't making no magic. You're the one supposed to make magic with that thing." He points to my saxophone. I smiled and told him I hoped to. Then he asked me if I had any money. When I told him I didn't, he asked me if I had a song. I shrugged. Maybe. The wino got ticked off. "I said you got a song. Don't give me this maybe shit." "Yes, I have a song, Genie." "Good," he says. "You also got yourself a partner." "Why do I need a partner?" Wino shook his head. "Don't you know who I am?" "Genie. You're a genie, right?" "Damn straight," he said. "And my magic is in my feet." And then Genie breaks into an earnest, if somewhat clumsy dance. Without his history of booze, I could easily imagine him a dancer of merit. After Genie danced his dance, he paused to catch his breath. "How's that? Did I pass?" "Pass what?" I asked. "The audition. Will you take me on as a partner?" I asked him again, why did I need a partner? Genie plopped himself down on the bench and offered me a sip of his Thunderbird wine. I declined. "Look, kid, I make my living dancing, but it's getting harder and harder to turn some change these days. All those damn hippies been cutting into my action. People losing interest in the solo performer. All they want is the spectacular, the spectacle." "So what's that got to do with me, Genie?" "Ain't you got no vision, kid? I need music for my show. We'll be partners. I can dance to anything. We'll do a 60-40 split." "With you getting the 60, huh, Genie?" "Course. I've scouted the best locations. I know which corners are jumping any hour of the day. Besides, I've been performing in Chicago for nearly 30 years. People know me." I was feeling bold, so I asked him if I was paying for his reputation. He told me, "Don't be so smart-ass. Maybe you ain't even any good." I grinned. "Maybe." "I told you to lay off the maybe crap. Let's see what you got." I explained to Genie that I had already played today, that I hadn't missed a day of practice in years. He just shrugged and said, "I could say the same thing about drinking. So what?" "So, listen to this." I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and tore into an imaginative pulsating rhythm. Next thing I know, Genie's snapping his fingers, and I heard him say, "I get it, man." Boy, he starts dancing like mad. Over the bench, under the bench, on top of the bench, just kicking and swinging his arms like a man possessed. It ended when he hurled himself against the bench, smashing the wine bottle in his back pocket. The explosion of broken glass and the wino's scream jolted me back to reality. What I saw was Jeannie sprawled out on the bench, whimpering. "What happened, Eugene? Are you all right?" "No, I ain't all right. You broke my bottle." He held out a handful of wet broken glass. I couldn't believe it. I hugged my saxophone. "You mean I got up that high?" "To hell with your high. What about mine? I ain't got nothing to drink." I pulled $1 out of my pocket. Jeannie snatched it out of my hand. "You're a dangerous man," he said. "You had me jumping and twitching like a worm with a match underneath it." I was delighted with my fiery performance and told him so. "You're a cruel son of a bitch," he said as he walked away, pulling shards of glass from his rump. I got real good at shoplifting. I managed to survive by sleeping in bus terminals and hustling my sax on the sidewalk. The breakthrough came one freezing night in the Chicago Greyhound bus terminal. I was having a restless night. No matter what I did, I couldn't get comfortable. Professor Bent always maintained that great musicians needed plenty of sleep. He'd say, "You can't perform for the gods if you are denied the sweet embrace of Morpheus." Since I was unable to sleep, I took a stroll on the upper platform where they kept the buses. I was hoping the exhaust fumes would make me drowsy. A chartered bus pulled in and unloaded a group of yawning musicians carrying expensive instrument cases that filled the air with the obnoxious smell of fresh leather. These musicians were followed by a short, fat man in a three-piece suit. He was scribbling something into this book and growling at the bus driver, demanding to know if the driver's superiors were aware of how rudely their employees treat the manager of the Monk's Corner ridiculously juiced jazz ensemble. When I heard who he was, I ran downstairs and squatted on the curb outside the Greyhound building and began playing my sax. I heard a band member say, "Check out the Roadrunner dude." Another guy asked me if I was gigging for the Lung Association. Then someone else laughed, "Beautiful, Jim, beautiful." But I was just warming up, saving my best stuff for the manager. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tapped out a rhythm with my shoe. When the band manager noticed his men crowding around the sidewalk, he shouted at them to "Get your butts over to the hotel." As the crowd broke up, he caught a glimpse of me sitting on the icy sidewalk playing my sax. He reached over and shook me. "Hey, kid, what you doing?" I couldn't believe it. It was the first time I'd ever been interrupted during a performance. He asked me if I was serious. I said yeah. Then he asked me how long I'd been at it. I told him I'd been playing for years, but was having a rough time. He laughed and said, "No wonder." Then he stared at the tip of my saxophone and, with this smirk, asked me, "You ever notice anything a bit peculiar about your style?" I jumped into my familiar defense. I told him I hear symphonies in my head. I explained that the only value my heart has is as a metronome. He shrugged and said, "Yeah, I know what you mean." Then he ripped a piece of paper out of his book and scribbled out an address and handed it to me. "I'll tell you what, we got a gig over at this club on the south side. Stop by tomorrow night at 9 and we'll see how your act goes over." "It's not an act," I insisted. "It's my life." Yeah, I got you, kid. Clean yourself up. And why don't you practice up your leads a bit? We can't have you blowing any clams 'cause this is a class gig." Then he laughed, slapping me on the back, and disappeared inside a taxi. At 10 to 9, I managed to stagger in to the Jicama Jazz Emporium. What a place! I squinted through thick clouds of smoke and saw two men in tuxedos making their way towards me. They grabbed me by my shoulders and lifted me 3 feet off the ground. "Hey, wait a minute, let me down. I'm a musician. Let go of me. How dare you? I'm an artist." One of the men kicked the saxophone out of my hands. It crashed to the floor. A couple of musicians at the bar recognized me and came to my rescue. I dropped to my knees, opened the case, and examined my sax. There was no damage. When I thought about what this guy had done, I threw a downfield block that sent him crashing into the bar. I wanted to kill him. I was dragged away by some musicians before the man could get up and avenge himself. The crowd was applauding me. I was taken backstage to Mr. Hackersby, the band's manager. "That's some ballsy thing you did, kid. Them Godzillas had it coming." I told Mr. Hackersby that I didn't care what people did to me, but when they started abusing my saxophone, I wouldn't permit that. I told him life would be nothing more than exertion and excretion if my sax was ruined. Hackersby said there were other saxophones to be had and that my life was certainly more important than an instrument. I explained that this saxophone represented a legacy. The immortality of a departed master survived through the fellowship of my lungs and this hallowed brass. Hackersby shook his head and agreed that my sax was the hollowest damn brass he ever saw. Then he said, "If you can put half the effort into playing your sax as you can defending it, you'll be a smash." He pushed out of the wings. The moment I stepped on stage, there was applause, and I heard someone yell out, "Atta boy, play like you slay." I bowed, put the saxophone to my lips, drew a professionally calculated breath, and vanished into my silent world of misplaced trust. I learned what really happened that night. It seems the audience was impatient, and then shocked when it became clear no music would flow from my saxophone. The crowd, I was told, grew restless and offended. Insults were yelled at me, but I was too absorbed in my music to know where I was or who I was with. Luckily, my absorption, coupled with my burlesque exaggerations on the saxophone, transformed a hostile crowd into one convulsed with laughter. Hackersby's gamble paid off. I must have looked pretty stupid out there. At the conclusion of my set, I was given an ovation, a standing ovation. Since I was ignorant of the laughter during my trance, I blew kisses to the audience and mumbled a thank you to Professor Bent. I felt that we were both vindicated. Mr. Hackersby signed me to a contract on the spot. The Monk's Corner ridiculously juiced jazz ensemble now had its first touring soloist. I was euphoric over my success and determined to work harder than ever at perfecting my craft. It was all hard work for me, not fun. We toured the United States and parts of Canada. Everything was going pretty smoothly. After a grueling gig in a tiny club in Nova Scotia, most of the musicians headed for the seedier parts of the island. Not me. I went back to my hotel room to practice. As I inserted my key in the lock, a blanket was thrown over me. My ankles were bound with rope, and I was hauled kicking and screaming to a car. My abduction ended when I rolled onto a marble floor. I sprang up, swinging wildly with my fists. When my eyes made the transition to light, I saw my abductors. They were 6 members of the band. I was confused. I asked what they were doing. "You know, guys, what's the idea?" They all laughed. And Ezra, this bald guy in sunglasses, put his arm around me. He said the guys were grateful for the creative lift I'd given the band and had decided on showing me a good time. "But you know I can't miss a day of practice." Ezra bit down on his mustache and said, "We know, Rick, but why not try loosening up a bit? Relax." I told him I was anything but relaxed. "Where are we?" He grinned and pointed to these scantily dressed women circling the room. Ezra puckered his lips at one of the women and said that we were in the hottest little whorehouse in the Commonwealth. One of the women, this 6'3" blonde in flesh-colored leotards, crept up behind me and stuck her fingers through the belt loops of my pants and started nibbling on my ear. I broke out of the Amazon's grip by using an old football move, which resurrected images of my father lying on the couch denying me music lessons, and of Professor Bint staring at me with the disgust he usually reserved for discoveries of cold French fries inside his chicken lickin' boxed lunch. I sprinted out the door and hid inside some bushes by the side of the road. When Ezra found me, I was still shaking. He apologized for getting me upset, but he thought if anyone could put a smile on my face, Skyscraper Sally could. I told him I wasn't angry. I knew they were acting in my best interests. I also knew I was slightly dull. It wasn't that I disliked women or anything weird like that, but I explained to Ezra that long ago I asked Professor Bint if I could cut down on my lessons and spend some time and money with girls. The professor sat me down and explained the medieval belief that when a man expends his precious bodily fluid, it upsets his internal chemistry and drains him of a large portion of his intellectual and creative energies. Bint said that women's purpose on this earth is to zap up a man's vitality by having him transfer it into her. It is artistic destruction by injection, if you know what I mean. I knew what he meant. Ezra pulled me to my feet and walked me back to the hotel. For 6 years, I toured with the Monk's Corner Ridiculously Juiced Jazz Ensemble. I loved the traveling and the respect of my peers. After that embarrassing incident in Nova Scotia, the guys never interfered with my privacy or practice sessions. When I was 23, my life was altered during a gig in Goose Creek, South Carolina. In the audience that night was a debt-ridden millionaire named Tony Pranklin. He was the innovator of the pet stone craze. You people remember that, don't you? Through greed and neglect, Pranklin squandered the fortune he made from his conception, advertising and marketing of the stones he swore would bring comfort to millions without the mess and expense of a breathing pet. Tony Pranklin was lazy, but he was no fool. He immediately saw the appeal of a silent saxophonist. When he visited me a couple months ago, he told me he had learned to exploit the universal fear of casting the first stone. Pranklin claimed that although my popularity originated through Traversity, and as the years went by the novelty of a reedless saxophonist might wear off, I would endure because he would promote me as an artist. Now, if this all sounds like a crock, all I can say is Pranklin pulled it off. I became known as the world's greatest saxophone player, but that comes later. Pranklin offered Hackersby $150,000 for my contract. I wasn't happy about the sale, but Pranklin promised me complete artistic freedom and the chance to reach an audience of millions. Pranklin pulled strings, and within weeks I popped up on national TV. My father saw me one night on a talk show. He wrote me a letter, apologizing for his behavior towards my music lessons. He said that the solo I performed on television reminded him of when he was in the Army in '43 and saw Woody Herman's band, but that he couldn't hear anything. I didn't know people were laughing at me. I didn't. I felt I was achieving artistic maturity and touching my listeners. Every time I finished a tune, all I heard was applause. How did I know? How could I know? 9 months after leaving the Juiced Ensemble, I cut a solo album produced by Pranklin. It was called Music for the Disenchanted and released by the Avant-Garde-Rama label. Although I heard elegantly textured orchestrations when I played the record, all anyone else heard was the clicking thud of sax keys against the pads and my breathing. But that didn't stop Tony Pranklin. He contacted a music critic for Art on Parade and coerced the man to publish a favorable review of my album. I have it here in my shirt pocket. I originally kept it out of pride. Now I keep it for... I don't know. This is it. Eric Tesler may be the most dynamic musical innovator on the scene today, Known throughout the nation because of his prolific television appearances, this is the young man's first attempt at recording, and he succeeds admirably. Like any pioneer of creativity, Mr. Tesler has attracted the indignation of some critics. These short-sighted people hate change. I believe these critics would even resist the change of a dollar bill at a grocery store. They claim it is absurd to purchase an album that only offers the sound of an artist inhaling and exhaling. Let me say this. Music for the disenchanted may, on a physical level, be just breathing. But as I replay Mr. Tesler's recording, it reminds me of God breathing life into Adam. Eric Tesler breathes life into a fresh musical genre. Can you understand how I felt when this came out? I had published proof that what I was doing was valid, don't you see? I'm not a fraud. I wasn't lying to myself or the public. In 12 years, I never missed a day of practice or a rehearsal. I was oblivious to fame and oblivious to the huge sums of money regenerating Franklin's bank account. The concert halls grew in size to accommodate the world's greatest saxophone player. This epithet was dreamed up by Franklin after he engineered my election to the South Carolina Music Hall of Fame and my winning of the annual Rantoul John Philip Sosa Memorial Award. This last honor truly touched me. On my 25th birthday, Franklin produced my second album, Quarter Century Blues in a Half-Assed World. By this time, Franklin had learned from his mistakes. Instead of the LP being a solo venture, he hired a backup group. 3 of the 11 tracks were my solos. On the remaining tracks, I played with an accompaniment. Quarter Century Blues in a Half-Assed World was a huge success. I was told recently that it's become a collector's item known as the birthday album. My popularity was at its peak. I was such an enormous box office draw that Franklin was able to book me into the Lincoln Center in New York City. The flight to New York was one of the most exciting afternoons in my life. Immediately after my plane touched down at Kennedy Airport, I made my way to a taxi stand and asked the cab driver to take me to the hippest jazz club in New York. He dropped me off at a place called The Cookery on 8th Street. There was a long line of people stretching from the club's entrance and all around the block. When I told the doorman I didn't have a reservation, he recognized me and said no problem. He directed me to a stage-side table, his table. Within minutes, the house lights dimmed, and a tall man with a beard brushed past me. The stage lights reflecting off his silver saxophone blinded me. I was rubbing my eyes when I heard my host announce, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, a musical legend, your friend and mine, Red Gorky Jr." There was applause. I squinted up at the stage because the light reflecting from the saxophone made it impossible for me to look directly at the musician. And then it happened. Red Gorky Jr. sucked at the air and produced the sweetest, most hauntingly beautiful sounds I've ever heard. My eyes became moist, and I started to shake. For years, I hadn't followed contemporary saxophonists. Professor Bent insisted it was dangerous to my development. For the first time in my life, I felt terror. Terror that, oh my God, I'd been living a lie for 13 years. The music soared out of that man's saxophone like a celestial conversation between the creator and the human spirit. I mean, it was a feeling I always experienced whenever I played, but as I looked around the club, I realized it was a feeling not limited to the artist, but shared by his listeners as well. I mean, when I played one tune, it would excite 100 people 100 different ways, but never, not once did anyone come close to describing what I felt while I was playing with what they had heard. Sometimes that would bother me. That's when Franklin would say, "Your music is much more sophisticated than you realize, and if you ever realize where this sophistication comes from, you'll probably be ruined as an artist." But listening to Red Gorky's sax, I knew all that mystical mumble-jumble about playing for the heart was a bunch of crap. It was the ears. The ears. I've been trained not to use my ears. I don't care what music critics wrote about me, it's the ears that count. I got up out of my seat and ran out the door. I was shattered. 15 minutes later, I was perched on a bar stool sipping a G&T when I heard a squeaky voice. Psst, psst. Are you Eric Tesler? I spun around, but didn't see anyone, so I went back to my drink. Hey, man, you Eric Tesler? I felt a tug on my pants cuff. I looked down at a smartly dressed midget biting a cigarette. You Eric Tesler, the world's greatest saxophone player? I cringed at the title. I told him I was Eric Tesler. Who are you? Just call me a fan, he said. Mind if I join you? I reached down and lifted him onto a stool. This angered the little guy. Let me go, will you? I ain't no baby. Want a smack in the mouth? I apologized and asked him what he wanted. I suspected it wasn't an autograph. The little man grinned, adjusted his tie, and handed me his business card. It read, Turner Arnold, the entrepreneur of Avenue B. I immediately recognized the name. He was the midget conductor that inspired me when I was young. Turner Arnold? You were one of my heroes when I was a kid. I read all about you in Beauty Knows No Pain. I expected him to be flattered, but he looked at me with disgust and said, You did, huh? I'm a musician who overcame my handicap in pursuit of my art, right, kid? I nodded. Right. I was excited. This was a great musician. But he just laughed and asked me if I believed everything I read. Turner Arnold told me the book was written by a second-rate writer who needed cash. Turner Arnold seemed to get pleasure out of telling me that this hack writer lied like a dog about him and everyone else in the book. I couldn't believe it. Turner Arnold said, Sure, I went to a fancy music school, but that stuff about me finding work after I graduated was pure bull. Nobody wanted me, nobody. They didn't even want me at the school, but I had enough bucks to get in, so they took me. I was always treated like somebody's joke. But I ain't here to talk about myself. I've been following your career for some time now. I run a pawn shop down on the east side. I trade mostly in weapons and musical instruments. Guess I can't get it out of my blood. Yeah, anyway, I got a present for you. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out this cane object that he held up in front of me like someone repelling a vampire with a cross. I asked him what it was, and he called it a reed. Turner Arnold said he knew I was playing Lincoln Center later that evening and had hoped to give it to me after the show. Then he explained how to position the reed onto the sax. I asked him if Red Gorky Jr. used one, and the midget smirked and said, You're catching on. Turner Arnold assured me I couldn't go wrong if I used the reed at my concert that night. I put the gift in my shirt pocket and looked at my watch. I was going on in an hour. I opened my wallet to pay for my drink, but Turner Arnold insisted on treating me. I thanked him again for the reed and hurried uptown. Lincoln Center was mobbed. The audience consisted of all types. I was told there was even a balcony filled with senior citizens representing the New Jersey Geriatric League for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. They were bussed in at taxpayers' expense to show their support for a music form that did not discriminate against their handicap. At 9:04 p.m., I dragged myself to center stage. I was bombarded with applause. The instant I stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. Ladies and gentlemen, my first number will be a composition I wrote backstage tonight entitled A Legacy of Laments for Lunatics, Listeners, and Lickin' Liars in F minor. For the first time in my career, I didn't close my eyes and drift into a creative vacuum. I filled my cheeks with air, toyed with the keys, and stared at the audience that had paid $18 a ticket to watch me. It was my first appraisal of an audience, and it made me sick. I released the air from my cheeks, pulled the saxophone out of my mouth, and disappeared backstage to vomit. I reappeared on stage to a standing ovation. Muttering curses under my breath, I shook my head and bowed. As I leaned forward, the reed fell out of my shirt pocket and bounced off my shoe. I smiled, picked it up, and attached it to my sax. The ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. When it finally died down, I bit into the mouthpiece, took a deep breath, and blew as hard as I could. The initial blast stunned me and the audience. As I manipulated the keys, the raucous sound dissolved into a crisp, blue-tinted rhythm. The audience gasped, but no one was more surprised than me. Employing the technique I forged out of years of silent practice, I made a smooth transition from a natural, romantic flow of melody to a series of forceful jazz riffs. I lost myself in the delightful music, not imagination, music. I didn't hear my fans shouting at me to stop. All I heard was the beautiful tunes I was producing. It was incredible. It'll always be the happiest moment of my life. A little while ago, I received a cassette in the mail from a fan of mine who was at my Lincoln Center performance. His recorder was smashed in the excitement, but he saved the tape. It's the only record I have of my music, and my most valuable possession. I was oblivious to the orchestra section running towards the stage, cursing me. The sound coming out of my saxophone took me far, far away. But not far enough. My fans surrounded me, and the last thing I heard was a plea to play what we paid for. The first blow landed on the back of my neck. It caused my teeth to clamp down on the mouthpiece. The follow-up blow knocked out 3 of my teeth, 2 of which I swallowed. Blood gushed out of my mouth, splattering the attacking mob. They pulled me to the floor and kicked my face. All of my ribs were cracked, and my leg was broken, and still they swarmed over me. Despite this punishment, I hunched over my saxophone, cradling it. Eventually my arms went limp. That's when the crowd turned their anger on my instrument. They stomped on my sax until it was nothing more than brass flecks. But I hurt, Dr. Wanda Platt. And I don't mean from the bruises covered by these bandages. You say that my injuries could not heal while I was in a coma because my body was using all its resources just to maintain my survival. I wished I never opened my eyes. You claim that my condition won't improve until I confront a saxophone. But it's over. My saxophone was destroyed, Doctor. Will you stop trying to force me to touch one? I told you, I want to stop feeling things. I listened to the other patients, Dr. Wanda Platt. I've heard them explain how experiencing a closeness with death clarified some kind of meaning or direction in their lives. Well, it hasn't happened to me. But you can't always trust what you hear. Right, Doctor? I'm scared, Dr. Wanda Platt. Real scared. But I'll get through it on my own, thank you. I've always been a solo act. Thank you again for joining us this week. I hope you enjoyed Beauty Knows No Pain by Mark Blickley. Again, I'll drop a bunch of links in the notes so you can check Mark out and some of the other projects he has going on. Again, you can follow him on Twitter at BlickWords or on Facebook, Mark Blickley. And if you're enjoying the stories that we're bringing to you every weekend, I hope you do, we're going to keep doing it. So please subscribe, share, rate, all that junk. Also, you can check us out on Facebook. Eventually, I'm hoping to do some lives with the authors so we can talk to them a little bit further, find out their process, and just kind of make it more of a interactive with the writers. Someday, once I figure out how to use the internet, I'll get that on the schedule. All right, if you're a writer and you would like to have your story featured on Pocket Pulp, shoot me an email at pocketpulpsubmission@gmail.com. My name is Eric Brian Moore, Eric with a C, Brian with a Y. You can follow me on Twitter, although I don't really know why you would. I don't say anything. I'm an actor. If I don't have a line written for me, I can't say it. At Eric Brian Moore, or you could check out my website, ericbrianmoore.com. The music for the podcast was made by Blue Mount Score and Eternal Producer from Pixabay. Thank you again for joining me. I look forward to reading you another fantastic story next week.